Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Tony Green, and in the time that we have today, we're going to share why climate change will never truly be solved until the race issue is addressed. Here is our agenda. I'll start off with climate change from a vantage point of color. Where are we? Then I'll talk about the why and how we got here. Then we'll move forward to truly solve climate change. And then finally, we'll close out with discussing climate change, the intersectionality. Are there any questions before we dive in? All righty, we'll have at it. I wanted to open with a quote. And the quote was, having slight issues. I wanted to open with a quote is that you can't have runaway emissions without dehumanization, which was made by Anthony Rogers Wright. And so the idea is that the decisions that led to emissions and their impact are based on the privilege of a few at the expense of the powerless, which implies a dehumanization of those who are powerless. And so what we will come back to that dehumanization theme a little later in the presentation. I founded Speaking Green Communications in 2016 with the idea that sustainability was not about separate races, but about our common humanity. I deliberately tried not to cover issues as not to touch race. And over time, I learned that I should not try to run away from these type of issues and that you shouldn't either. Through my experiences, I've come to learn that sustainability in general and climate change in specific cannot be separated from race. And so tonight we'll learn that some of the causes and impacts of climate change are the same places where we can look for solutions. We'll start with a journey on a look on where we are as a planet. As you may be aware, atmospheric carbon dioxide is higher than at any time within the past 800,000 years and are increasing faster than at any time in millions of years. And so what the idea is that some of these things impact everyone. However, in many cases, the impact is uneven. Case in point, in some ways, climate change impacts everyone in terms of wildfires or sea level rise. But more specifically, it can impact people of color in terms of the different impacts based on land displacement and disasters and their resilience, or we've seen with COVID-19. Another impact is it impacts the animals and plants, or really the biodiversity of our planet. And so what I kind of wanted to take a look at was how exactly did we get here? Where are we as for minorities? Well, before I discuss that, I wanted to answer that the impact is uneven, but the voice of those most impacted is not heard. An example is minorities had essentially no voice in the Paris Accord of 2015. For those of you not familiar with the Paris Accord, it is an agreement that was reached, which was non-binding in terms of that all of the countries agreed that they should combat climate change. But what happens is the limit was really set as 2.0 Celsius, and it really should be 1.5 because that was the level that survival was going to be more likely for many of the sub-Saharan nations. And not going down to 1.5 makes it a lot less painful for the other countries that actually caused climate change. And so in many ways, you hear 1.5 Celsius or 2 Celsius targets. Well, 2 degrees is a target, but it really should be 1.5 because that is really what we're going to need to see to impact many of the sub-Saharan island nations, which may actually be underwater by the end of the century. All right, and so let's get down to what this is actually about. This is really about the colonial imperial era, and that understanding is key to how we arrived here. There's a quote by E.O. Weissman that says that the current acceleration of climate change is not only an unintentional consequence of industrialization. The climate has always been project for colonial powers, which have continually acted to engineer it. And so you may be wondering on what the relationship is between colonialism and climate change. And so what I will say here, and we'll talk about where I come to this later, climate change is a hangover of centuries of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit more detail. Interestingly enough, the colonies were arranged to maximize and facilitate extraction, and profit was the compass. In fact, the New World's territories were vacant lands, lands where no one existed, which was open for conquest and colonizing. And so you look at the Arctic and the Outback and the Wild West and even the Amazon, they are and continue to be enduring metaphors that allowed the colonizers to depict territories as barren wastelands. But the reality is these lands were not empty. The action of negation, discovery, was used to justify the clearance of the native habits and inhabitants. And since there's always more land to conquer and acquire, sustainability was essentially irrelevant. And so this impact on nature by depletion of resources and the people by the economic impact. And so we can view colonialism as a triple violence: colonial violence through negation, economic violence through exploitation, and political violence through oppression. Now, the common factor is that colonialism took states to seek access to new lands, resources, and labor. So what happened was that the new territories were seen as business enterprises, and the local inhabitants were either obstacles to either removed or workforces to be subjugated. And so what happens is, in order to really fix the climate crisis, we need to face up to our imperialist past. And part of that is going to be sharing the wealth. And in case you're wondering how the wealth got so uneven, we can also discuss that. The global economy is organized along colonial systems, and that has a framework as such. Rich countries continued to conquer distant lands, and they called them colonies. And then they savagely exploited not just their people, but the people to exploit their resources. Then they sold each other the stuff that those exploited people and lands produced. And so if you want to know who the people buying all these things are, it's the 10% of the globe who were rich. So what was really going on economically was the world's richest 10% was simply trading goods made through the exploitation of others. And the prices of all these goods were really artificially low. And so violence and aggression of extreme kinds, from torture to genocide, was used to obtain it. And so what happens is today, we don't call that colonialism anymore. We call that the global economy or capitalism. But to be honest, much has not changed. And so that's kind of why I say that not only climate change is a hangover of centuries of colonialism and exploitation, but it's also inextricable from humanity's long and sordid history of inequity and justice. And this is why today's map of climate change hotspots mirrors only almost exactly of yesterday's map of colonialism and slavery. And so climate change really isn't about me, relatively well-to-do Westerner. What it is really about is about our history, our systems, our ideologies, what we did to each other as a world because of them, centuries of violence and enslavement, and the part you still play in all that, even without knowing it. And so again, the 10% of the world's rich today is exactly the 10% of the world that has colonized, enslaved, brutalized, and exploited the other 90% for centuries. And so currently, our economic system is designed to minimize labor costs and the production of materials over the health and well-being of workers. And what it does is it really relinquishes our economic destiny to ostensibly free market consistently that underprices the environmental impacts and channels too much. And so that the wealth society generates, which goes to the highest percentile of the income spectrum. And unfortunately, racism perpetrates this system. So then you may ask the question, is racism the root cause of climate change? And to that, I would say no, because what happens is its pervasive presence in society, though, is indispensable to the persistence of an extractive, exploitative, and inequitable economic system. And so part of understanding how we get here is looking at really our history, the why and how of how we got here. And so what happens is the foundation of this country was based through expansion, colonialism, and exploitation. And so what occurred was that there was a system that needed to be maintained to implement the status quo, which really only benefited a few. And so the results are organizations that I'm sure that we can recognize today. And so the power, again, was needed to be maintained to keep one group privileged versus another. And so that's kind of what led to the pollution of what we call the police, our laws, incarceration. I'm sure you can think of some other instances. And so the whole idea was to keep the status quo system in place that benefited a few and that kind of took advantage of the others. And so I'd like to ask a question about what would happen if equality would have occurred, right? Well, what would happen was these stolen advantages would have been leveled out, and things would be a lot more equal that there have been. And so there are some systems that were really put into place to maintain this non-equality. Perhaps you might be familiar with them. Residential segregation, known as redlining, unequal education opportunities, which was addressed in Board versus the Brown of Education, limited prospects for economic advancement. You can even look at, in terms of Black Lives Movement and incarceration rates, or how this was all designed to keep things unequal. Also, you could look at Plessy versus Ferguson, which struck down the whole idea of separate but equal, Jim Crow laws. But what I'd like to make a point is this wasn't just in the US. What had happened was this model extended globally. And so basically, and so that's kind of where we're saying is that this system in place is in a lot of ways how climate change has come to be and the rather uneven uneven impacts. And so moving forward, you always try to want to bring solutions. And so the idea is, what do we do? Well, the question is, we need to change the system. The idea is that the task of dismantling systemic institutionalized racism requires more than superficial features. But what it entails is changing and even eliminating long-standing systems that lead to inequality. And so that's why the time has come for change. And so this change isn't going to be subtle. It's going to be totally fundamentally different from the lives that we have all been accustomed to. And that's the level of change that is going to be needed if we're going to solve climate change. And so that's why I say we have to solve race as well, because it goes back to the underlying issues of why we were here. Okay, some things that I would want to suggest that we can do is what happens is right now, our government does not really represent the bulk of the people. And so what happens is politics at some point needs to be able to relate the face of the people who reside in the country. Another thing I'd like to mention is the scarce representation of scientists. And so what happens is a lot of these ideas climate change, environment, so on and so forth, are basically science-based. So if our politicians don't have a science base, they're really the blind leading the blind. And so I think what a big thing would be to get more folks in politics that have a political, excuse me, that have a scientific base. If you look at the US, where our politicians are all lawyers and businessmen. Whereas if you look at China and many of the countries in Europe, a lot of them are science and engineering based, and it really does impact on how they view things that are involved with technology. Another thing I would like to mention is, when I kind of touched on it already, is that our elected representatives need to really represent the people. This country is turning browner with every single day, and at some point, it needs to be. It's the politicians need to represent the face of the people who represent us. So, what if our politicians actually represented us? It is a very, very interesting kind of idea. Another thing that I'm very big on is the Green New Deal. And so what happens is, and this quote says it pretty well, the Green New Deal is not just about solar panels. It tackles deep-rooted issues of race and inequality, providing a path forward for us all. And so that's the fundamental system change on the magnitude that we need in order to solve these problems. And so there has never been a clear case for a Green New Deal. And so, which would help us deal with the climate change issues, which of course need to be addressed, but also the people issues and the inequity issues. And so just for reference, the three pillars of the Green New Deal: stop climate crisis through a 10-year nationwide mobilization, create millions of good jobs, and ensure economic prosperity for all, not a few, and establish a second Bill of Rights and defend the dignity of all people, which was kind of a forethought when the colonial model went into place. And there's also a forethought and afterthought in terms of the system that kept the status quo in place. One of the things I wanted to take away is climate work touches everything: poverty, education, and civil rights. And the faster people realize this, the more effective that we can come at addressing solutions. And so this intersectionality on how everything is connected, on why I say race would not really, excuse me, climate would not be addressed until race is. And so when you see that everything is interconnected, when you start fixing things at the root, then you'll start to uncouple all of these things. And so that's why climate change will not be solved until race is addressed. And so, because it really doesn't address the root cause of how we got here. All right. Climate work touches everything, and it needs to matter to white folks, because when our communities succeed and get what they need, everyone benefits from that. And so the whole idea is all this division has really done nothing for people overall. It's just kept a few in positions of power. And so people who are non-minority need to realize that when everyone succeeds, we all succeed as a benefit of that. And so a little bit more about Speaking Green Communications. You can find out more at www.speakinggreencommunications.com, where you can read my blog, sign up for my newsletter, and keep up with my latest event schedule. This is some of the things of the topics that I have covered and will cover in the past. And if you want to reach out to me, please feel free. The email is below, and I look forward to feedback in terms of what I've said here. And so on that, I'll take questions. If you are viewing online, please feel free to send me an email, and then we can touch base about that. I wanted to thank you for your time and listening. And if at some point you want to hear this talk when we get rid of COVID, and we will get through COVID, please reach out, and we can begin a dialogue about there. And so remember, race, climate will never be truly solved until race is acknowledged and addressed. Thank you for listening.